So welcome once again to our November OSPOlogy webinar. Today's topic is going to be about how to automate your FOSS policy and processes. And for that, we have with us Thomas from EPAM Systems. But before deep dive into this topic, OSPO News to the group has been trying to enhance collaboration and build cross-community collaboration across other open source communities that at some point are helping the OSPO movement. And one of those open source communities is Scale. And one of these initiatives is the OSPO Metrics Working Group that we just launched a month ago or so. It's under Chaos Project. They're having bi-weekly calls where these working groups gather together and discuss about OSPO metrics standards and ways to implement those standards into existing tooling and open source tooling from the Chaos Project. Another new, so we got some feedback. There was not clear structure of the OSPO and Tudu community. So we have been improving the community page. We now launched the second OSPOlogy Live. That is going to be happening on January next year, and it's hosted by our friends at Aliander, OSPO at Aliander, and co-organized with other open source communities such as OpenChain, Chaos, XPDX, OpenSSF, and Tudu Group. It will be mainly focused on open source for public organizations and the energy sector. We have a new OSPO local meetup in Helsinki. In 2 weeks, they will be having the first meetup. The next OSPOCon event will be in Japan. People that are new here, Tudu is not just a network space, but it's also a way where people can contribute to OSPO resources. So for that, we have the OSPOlogy working hours that happens monthly, and we have 2 different items. And for those unfamiliar with OSPOlogy webinars, OSPOlogy webinars is part of a bigger part that is called OSPOlogy. The studies of OSPOs includes several networking spaces and different artifacts such as OSPO News, the OSPO mind map, the OSPO model. There are many ways the community can get started to contribute, not only code, but also write documentation, translate documentation in other languages, host regional sync calls, present at OSPO as in OSPOlogy, such as like Thomas is doing, or even report backs. Here are some, these OSPOlogy sessions are recorded, not the discussion part that is under Chatham House rule, and is in our OSPOlogy YouTube channel. And saying this, we have Thomas from EPAM Systems that is going to be talking about how to automate your FOSS policies and processes.
Okay, welcome all. So in this session, I will show you how you can automate your FOSS policy and processes. A little bit about myself. My name is Thomas Steenbergen. I am the head of open source program offices at EPAM, and I help organizations with their open source management and supply chain, but besides running the EPAM's OSPO. As you can see, I have quite a lot of roles inside of the open source community, as I'm really building my OSPO in the open source way. So it's all related tooling. It will come clearer later in the presentation on how I'm involved with all of these projects and why. Okay, a little bit about OSPOs, and I've been borrowing some material Anna created. So OSPOs are really the industry standard for managing open source in an effective and strategic way. And so I took some numbers from the recent September to-do group survey. And as you can see here, 97% of the organizations say like, hey, we include open source components in our products. And 64% say, yeah, we either have already an OSPO or we're planning to build one. And 83% said like, yes, an OSPO is a great way there's really a positive impact on our software practices. Yet, what also a lot of OSPOs reported was that insufficient funding was one of their top challenges. So let's go look what an OSPO is normally responsible for. I took this overview from the to-do mind map. You can find it as ospomindmap.todogroup.org, and it really shows all the responsibilities an OSPO commonly can have. If you dive a little deeper, you can actually break it down in all the various layers, and you see really an OSPO has a lot of responsibilities. And And it can be broken down in either policy and process ones. Here, I just took the one for today. So I looked at like open source compliance, policy and policies, and about releasing. These are the two topics we will dive in later. So how can you automate your open source compliance, and how can you automate releasing an open source project? But as you can see, generally, there's a lot of subtasks. So what you also can say that generally speaking, OSPOs have a lot of responsibilities. They have a wide variety of tasks, but they have insufficient funding. So how can we address this? This is my standard answer when people ask me a question. Solve OSPO challenges via industry collaboration. Work together. And actually, all the components you need are already in place in the community. It just needs some time to navigate the waters. But if you want to talk about community best practices, we're here to do. But also you can talk, if you're a financial resource, you can talk about FINAS. Or if you want to learn about metrics, you talk about chaos. Or if you're a government institution, there's OSPO+. If you want to know standards for your compliance program, have a look at the Open Chain project. And if you want to do software bill of materials, have a look at SPDX. Similarwise for processes, a lot of for InnoSource Foundation has done a lot of good work of detailing out patterns, and the Open Chain Automation Group has made a whole reference map on how you can do your compliance processes and how you can implement them with tooling. For security, we now have OpenSSF since last year. And finally, for automation, we have OSS's Toolkit. So really, everything you need is there. But that's not actually specifically why I chose in Master to use open source. For me, it's also a very obvious one. There is not really a manual for me as an OSPO how to do things. There's not one book and say this is an OSPO. My OSPO is not your OSPO. But so the best way for me to address my challenges is to work together, especially since the majority of my challenges comes from the open source community. And it requires me to fix things upstream. So yes, I can use proprietary solutions, but they usually patch things in my organization, but it doesn't fix things upstream. So what happens in the end, especially if you look like at compliance, as long as the open source community doesn't have good compliance tools, they will not be able to find the issues that I might find out with my commercial tools, and they will not fix it. So I will get into what I commonly refer to as a compliance hamster wheel. So that's why I really prefer to contribute to the open source community and move the community as a whole forward. Let's do a little bit the deep dive. Let's go look at a breakdown of FOSS compliance for software projects. There are some policy bits and there are some process bits. And some common bits. Again, not everything is included here. It's just at a high level, what could you commonly see in a policy? So usually a policy has things about what developers, how they should include topics. How about mixing code? So we take open source proprietary. How security vulnerabilities were remediated. And how, for instance, licenses should be classified and how the rules should be defined. So usually defines things in the policy. Is usually, it can be either a Word document, a PDF, or some people put it even under the commons bits. And then you have, as an OSPO, you have all the processes that are related to compliance. So there is a process usually that works on the identification. Then you might have, say, if some companies have approvals for the open source that you can use. Then there is a whole review process, usually like, okay, so you want to use this open source. Okay, how does it fit in? What is the provenance of this package? How does the community look like? What does the security look like? What licenses are in there? And finally, you will usually see that there is some approval process, basically, or at least guidelines set out by like a FOSS steering committee or a review board. And then there is a process that like, okay, we now have this approved open source. Now we have to comply to all of the obligations that come with the licenses. And finally, there's usually a process from, okay, there are some issues. We need to do license or security advisory clearance, or we need to do code updates. So again, lots of processes that you have to do as an OSPO commonly. Luckily, there is some help. Again, I took this slide from the Open Chain program, where they outline basically a compliance program. I will not cover all the bits of what a compliance program entails, but I recommend you to go and visit openchainproject.org. and you will find all the materials that you need. But generally, there's two high things that they outline for a compliance process. Basically, it says know your obligations and satisfy your obligation. If you do this, there is going to be lots of benefits that are listed on the bottom of the screen here. So great. Okay, OpenChain tells me that. I love it. So what do I need to do? Hey, luckily they also provide me a slide to basically say like, hey, if you use open source, these are the things that you really should keep track of. So I was like, okay, thank you, OpenChain. Saves me a lot of work of creating this list myself. And I know that multiple people have worked on this list, so it's actually pretty complete. So now let's look at how the process could look like. And this may be a scary picture as well, but I drew up a reference process. If I were to automate, how would it look like? And of course, I'm doing it in a modern way. So I do my open source reviews inside my continuous integration. So inside my GitHub, GitLab, or Jenkins, or whatever your flavor of CI system that you're running. And so let's look and talk through it. So usually it starts at any CI that you have a code change, then you have a scanner, then the scanner can basically has some inputs, and so basically it looks at product info and all other stuff, and then the scanner makes an assessment from the compliance is thumbs up, or if it's thumbs down. If it's thumbs up, of course, you're done, you can continue your job, but if it's thumbs down, then usually there is a way where the developer has to address the scan findings. So that's what you see here, address the scan findings. And it might be so say that like, oh, she needs to make a code change. Maybe update the dependency, call it down, update dependency, goes again to the regular review flow in say GitHub with a pull request. And if it's thumbs up, boom, it gets merged, and a new scan gets triggered, and then the scan is okay. So it's a common loop. It might also be that it's not a code change requirement, but let's say like a curation is needed. So curation is basically usually that what is an industry term for clarifying things. So it means, for instance, be this, yeah, we're using this package, but we're only using this for development. It doesn't end up in the release artifact. Or yes, this license that was found by the scanner is part of the source code of the package, but it's not actually part of the release artifact. Or yes, there's a security vulnerability reported for this, but actually it's not applicable because we're not using this part of the code. So what you generally see in most workflows, and how I would do, you can do this by a review of another dev if it's a security team. But if it's in a global system, I usually prefer to have the OSPO review, especially if it's on licenses. Why do we want to do this? Well, the workflow that I recommend is to do license clearance globally. So if you use one open source package and you clarify the licensing for one open source packaging, then I would say save this centrally and then reuse it throughout your organization. Because otherwise each developer team will have to do their own clearance, and it just doesn't scale. So again, if it's then all okay, it gets merged, scanned, and you get on top. If it's not okay, it loops back. But then there's the case, okay, what if there needs some help? Well, that's where we build this line in. And here you can either build a process where you build a support ticket or a support chat. Notice how in the CI/CD workflow, I basically don't use a ticketed-based workflow, but I only basically involve supporting functions upon request or when something has to be done globally. So the OSPO, the legal, and security, they are only involved when absolutely needed. This is, though, on the presumption that when this project was onboarded to the scan, it was already pre-cleared. So this is the CI process. I normally have a separate process, what they call the onboarding process, where we make sure that the scan is green, legal, security handle has done their checks. But in CI/CD, basically the project is onboarded, it should all be gone. It's just upkeep. So you want to have a lightweight process that is quickly to complete and just continue. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't monitor actually what's going on. So this is why on the right-hand side, we have the audit process. And the audit process basically, the rendering is a little bit, what it does is basically it monitors whatever scans are done. And if there are certain criteria, it basically triggers an audit ticket. And the audit ticket usually, again, this might be, for instance, a developer decides to suppress all of the scan issues in a minute. That's kind of suspicious behavior because you can't really usually fix all the issues. That probably means the developer is clicking the ignore button a lot. So then you want to have really an audit event triggered, and then you want somebody from the OSPO to look at it and basically say like, oh, is this thumbs up? If the thumbs up, nothing happens. But if it's thumb down, some developer didn't look what happened. You really want to have him say like, okay, let's kick this back to the development team and basically have them really have a look at it instead of just ignoring this. So the good thing how I designed this, the process workflow, as soon as the developer here claims thumb down, what it will happen is it will just actually trigger an extra issue inside of the scan, and they will just see like another scan issue. So it's just two harmonious flow. What you don't want is you want to have a separate Jira workflow that basically is two different queues. You want to have it as much as possible in this ISD. The other side, how this workflow could get started, is basically if there is timed, and this is if the metrics support. So basically, as an OSPO, I always recommend that you put metrics in place to measure your own success. So including compliance. So you should really measure how well you're doing. And if, say, you make a policy change rule and all of a sudden your behavior changes, then we might look at it. So the second workflow that's actually in here is basically where if a policy change is needed, it goes back to the policy decision by the FOSS steering committee or governance board, which is where business, OSPO, and legal and security work together to decide to make org-wide open source decisions. Now, I recently had a question on LinkedIn, who should make the decisions whether an open source package can be accepted? And my default answer is always use a FOSS steering committee or a governance board. Do not leave this over to the individual developers or make this a legal topic or security topic. This is really that something should be decided as a business, ideally as a whole, but in the end, it's a business decision. But there's something special about FOSS is like if one product owner, for instance, decides to approve a particular FOSS package, and it has a major security vulnerability in there. If there's then an insecurity incident and basically there's a lot of bad press about your organization because you got hacked because of this open source package, yeah, that goes way beyond that product owner's remedy. So this is always where I'm like, normally in a business, the decision is always with the product owner, but in some cases, like open source, it might have broader impacts. Now let's look at publishing an open source project. Again, we have policies, we have processes. Again, from the policy side, you always want to have a contribution aligned with what your organization is doing. You also don't want it to compromise your organization's IP, and you also usually have something, so again, an approval in place for when an open source project is released. Then you have usually a whole set of processes from where it starts with like, okay, we start with formulating the business case, we need to secure funding, then we clean up the code so it can be released, then we make sure that the naming of the project is okay, then you usually have a whole set of reviews, so the patent review, the legal review, security review, all those things to get the project ready. And finally, you usually have the OSPO giving the contributors some guidance on like, if they're especially not used to the open source community, to be like, hey, this is kind of how you should do things in the open source way. And when everything is thumbs up, you usually set up the GitHub repository or the GitLab repository. And then finally, you publish the code, and you might publish the artifacts as well to Maven Central or in NPM. Again, a lot of work for an OSPO. So how would a process look like for that one? So again, I designed a reference process. It looks maybe a little bit complex, but actually it's fairly standard loop. What I did is actually I used exactly the same loop here on the top as I was using for my compliance process. Why? Because a lot of the steps inside of my releasing a new project, actually they overlap with my internal for my compliance checks for software projects. Again, we had license review, we had security review. So why not use the same process? Just make it easier on developer. They already know it, and they can just reuse it. But in parallel, I created the bottom workflow. So again, they have this whole scan on top, and if they're okay, but then we have this whole workflow on the bottom. Again, so here we have the first step always is the approval decision by your FOSS steering committee or governance board to basically say, can we release this, yes or not? If that's okay, then it goes to a patent review. Lots of people have asked me, Thomas, can you automate a patent review? And my answer is not really. So patents are about functionality of code. Most software doesn't describe their functionality in a machine readable way. And also you have to know the other way. Patents don't come in a machine readable way where you say this patent describes if you have this kind of behavior, then my patent covers it. No. Patents, although they're supposed to be very narrow, they have some that are really generic. So you really need a patent engineer to sit down, have a look at your own organization's patents and other third-party patents in the area to really review. You can't really automate it. I do recommend that you build in your processes some kind of a check where the OSPO generally has a look on like what type of project is. If it's a simple tool that probably there are like a dozens of already in the market that do similar things, probably a patent review is not needed. But if you're doing an entirely new thing, say machine learning, yeah, probably you wanted to have a patent review. Now, once the patent review goes through, it basically goes again back to the OSPO. But in parallel, what I recommend is to basically, as soon as the patent review says thumbs up, then you're from IT writer, why don't you start automating your infrastructure provisioning? Set up that GitHub repository already, maybe as a private repository, and then move the project already. So the next stage where the OSPO comes in for recommended practices. So make sure that there's a README MD, contributing MD, make sure that the getting started instructions are actually easy to follow. You can all do this already at the live stage, because that also happens if you do this in parallel. The team can already set up the CI/CD, everything. And then finally, once it's ready, you have a loop here. Again, more code requests. Once it's finally up, done, it merges, and then we release, and then we're out of the door. So I kind of skipped over it. I went briefly over the scan, but how do we actually commonly automate the scan phase? We actually use an open source project on the Linux Foundation for it called OSPOlogy or ORT. It's basically been my default tool for the last 7 years now. And this is a high level of kind of how the tool works. It goes from left to right. So first you define what is actually released and what is not released. You can fix any licensing issues after the scan as well. Then it analyzes what are your dependencies in your source code. It supports about 20 different package managers. Then it downloads all of the source code so it can do all of the copyright scanning. In the next stage, the scanner, then you can choose multiple scanners if you want to scan your source code. And finally, it goes to the evaluator, which basically applies policy rules that you've written onto everything that's available. And then it can also, via the advisor, pull down security advisories. And at the end, you basically get a various reports, or you get SBOMs. And also with the notifier component, you can send out emails, or you can create Jira tickets. It's really in a nutshell, everything you need basically to, on one side, do your compliance process, but also do your contributing process. It can do both. So why should you use ORT? First of all, it's created with and by the OSPO community. So the most of the maintainers come now from mostly automotive OSPOs. But the basis has been growing for quite a bit. So we also have users in the telecom space, in energy space, and now also the first financial services are trying it out. And the ORT maintainers are active, and said in all of the related communities, from SPDX, OpenChain, OpenSF. We're really trying to build the best possible solution to do this in an open source way. It's also a battle tested solution. So it's been, as I said, it's been used for hundreds of thousands of scans over the last 6+ years, and it comes with everything you need in the box. So you'll get the tooling, you get a lot. Some of the OSPOs are sharing the data, and you have reference policies. So the idea was always, and this is one of the things that I like about, when you have a new OSPO, they usually started with compliance, and compliance is like this big hurdle that they need to get over. But what if you could just reuse the stack that other OSPOs already have built, and you could just get started, instantly provide the similar stack as is used in some of the largest automotive companies. And it's all free. It's all open source. Yes, it requires you to basically do some integration engineering, but basically it's probably basically a faster and cheaper and better solution than if you go commercial. As I said, it supports, so all of the things you already need are there: package managers, DevOps integrations, and you can really build everything that. So what does ORT do? It can do license scanning, so copyright and licenses. You can do security scanning. It supports various integrations, for instance, Nexus IQ, OSS Index, OSV. It can do best practices company standard scanning. Now, this is usually I get a lot of questions about what the heck does that mean. Very simple. As an organization, you're using a lot of open source build tools. Those open source build tools are very flexible. But what you want is you want to have some minimum engineering standards in place that you can enforce. So you want to say all my packages are, in our case, say com.epam. And I want every package to have a license, a description, and a source code location defined. You can just do that. You can just tell ORT to do it. You can also say like, oh, for all my open source projects, I want a README MD and a contributing MD to be present. It also has support for source code scanning. So if you want to do snippet scanning, but for that, you need to use one of our supported commercial vendors. You can do policy as code. So literally you have access to all the information that ORT gathers, and you can write whatever rule you want. That you're really, really flexible, and several reference rules are provided. And you can, of course, generate software bill of materials and notices. Okay, let's maybe see the tool a little bit in action so you can actually get a better idea. So this is the ORT GitHub page, and where you can find the project. To run it, it's basically ORT comes with you can use its integration. So I now use it in a GitHub action, and I just generate the ORT results. But if GitHub is not your what you use internally, well, you can also use GitLab. So here I run the same. In this case, the build failed because there are some policy violations. Let me just show you. So here we have the ORT scan that ran over a project, and I can just click it, and then I can just see the results. So here you see all of the results artifacts that were generated by ORT. So we have some web app reports that we can open. You have your SBOMs here, and you have your open source notices that were generated. I actually have those things already downloaded on my machine. So here you see the web app from ORT. So you can see these are the rule violations. So here is some copy left. If you want to know how to fix this, you can actually just click it. It comes with a default so-called how to fix e-tags. This is kind of a recipe that helps developers fix the issues by themselves. And this is also allows you to do a workflow using inner source. So instead of each team doing its own clearance, you can actually do this together as an organization. And as I said, this is also publicly available, so you can also do this together with the whole ORT community if you wanted to. And just for completeness, here you have the SPDX SBOM that was generated for this project. It's really, ORT gives you everything you need basically out of the box. So finally, I wanted to share some lessons learned doing automation for several years. First of all is reuse, reuse, reuse. I always see people building processes that basically work outside the existing systems of an engineers. If you build something for engineers, just integrate it. And it doesn't mean that you use a tool that basically is integrating your CI, but then they have to click on it and they go to a completely different environment. I usually prefer to have it completely integrated for a very simple reason. If I rely on the GitHub or GitLab in my organization, and I do full integration, I don't have to have any operational capability in my OSPO. I just reuse systems that are already paid for and kept operational by my organization. So that means I don't need to have a system engineers that keeps my system up and running and 24/7 available. Because I need to be 24/7 available because my organization is probably a global one releasing all over the world. Next one, automation requires minimal engineering standards. And I've worked with a lot of organization, and it always surprises me what engineering standards are in place. It can be really hard compliance where they detailed everything out till absolutely nothing. And it's all different. My general recommendation, if you want to do automation, put some minimum engineering standards in place. And my one is the best one is just enforce what the build tools provide you. So don't invent your own, just look at the build tools, and if the build tool says that a declared license have to be done in this way, just include that in your standard. Just use what's already there in the build tools, and you can use or to enforce. Next one, talking about enforcement, a nice thing that we figured out is actually if you automate this, people ask way less questions than if you have the same thing on your wiki page. Because people generally assume if something is enforced by a bot, it must have been agreed upon by the organization. So I recently had a question from somebody working for an OSPO, like, yeah, but we cannot, as an OSPO, we cannot set engineering standards. And I was like, why not? Just put them in the tool, even as a warning, and you will see that over time, people start to fix these things. Because all you're doing is you're asking them, as I said, minimum standards to fix things that are basically in the reference manual of their build tool to declare, for instance, a license or the source code location. Next one is one thing that we really did, and I showed you really quickly, this how to fix me text. This has really made a big difference on how we really improved our compliance, but also in our release process. So instead of having to have a conversation with each developer when they release an open source project, I just wrote a how to fix me text, basically like, these are the best practices in our organization. When you scan your project and you feel you don't have a contributing MD, it shows you a nice policy violation. Hey, you're missing a contributing MD. This is why, as an organization, we recommend a policy ID. And here you have some links or a basic standard template that we have that you can use as your template for your project. Next one, what we did is we do a rollout. So whenever we roll out the organization, we call this drive down, shift left. So people are like, what does that mean? Well, you can do it where you give this to the tool to your whole organization and pray it works. My preferred approach is to basically drive down, so go deep in the organization, clear up a whole stack, a whole unit, end to end. And the way how ORT allows me to do it is I can use the same how to fix me text, that if a team has, say team A has a dependency team B, the how to fix me text, you can write it in such a way that says like, hey, please contact, you have a dependency on team B has, that this project of them has a problem, please contact them and have them start the same process as well. And what you then get is basically an organic spread to the whole unit and through the whole stack of cleaning them up and getting used to it. And since getting started is usually relatively easy for them, they usually start again. And again, it needs to work with your process. But as the reference processes I just showed you, this really works. It takes some effort, but if your OSPO is basically set up to assume it to be open and transparent, people will just reach out and say like, hey, I got a ping from this team that we are breaking the scan. I found the issue, but I need some help to fix it. And finally, policy rules do change. In my case, every 2 weeks, but the principles stay the same. So people are like, oh, I write my policy rules once and I'm done. No. If you do things highly automated, you move with the change in your software projects, you move with changes in the community. So what you'll see is that the high level intent of your policy rules is the same, but your principles, so the principles will stay the same, but the rules actually change as new technologies get introduced, as new products get introduced. That's it from my side. I'm happy to answer any questions, and I will also welcome people who are interested to join the ORT Slack channel if you are interested in collaborating. Anna, back to you.